Hello, Andy Edwards here, and today I'm going to be ranking the albums of one of the greatest rock bands of all time, Led Zeppelin. As a kid, I would say that Led Zeppelin were my favourite band, my favourite rock band, definitely. And so this ranking, every single one of these is one of my favourite albums, so I've had to try and order them from my sort of least favourite album to most favourite, and it's very subjective as well. I might have a slightly different viewpoint from every other ranking video, in that in 1999 I became Robert Plant's drummer, and I stayed with Robert for a couple of years in a band called the Priory of Brion. So and being a big Zepp fan, I got to chat with Robert a lot about obviously Led Zeppelin in his solo career, and a lot of the influences and little events that surrounding the making of these albums. But I'm really talking this from a point of view of a big Led Zepp fan. So, like I said, all of these albums I love. It's really been hard to rank them. I think most of the second half could easily be my favourite Zepp album. This is really difficult. But if I had to put one at the bottom, and I don't really want to, it would be this one, In Through the Outdoor. Okay. This album, right? What can you say? Carouselambra is a fantastic track. It's one of my favourite Zepp tracks. Bonham's drumming on this is just off the scale. Me being a drummer, I love John Bonham's drumming. Fall in the Rain is one of the great drum tracks of all time. But for me, this album lacks a little bit of the energy of a normal Zepp album. I think Jimmy Page wasn't as involved as he normally would have been, and so John Paul Jones stepped in. So his keyboard playing sort of is on this album a lot. There's quite a lot of sort of quite comic tracks, interesting little quirky tracks. When we get to Coda and you listen to some of the outtakes of Coda from this session, you wonder why those tracks that were much heavier and more interesting from my point of view were on this album. I also think at this point Zeppelin, punk had happened, new wave was happening, they were going into the 80s. I think they were wondering how to go into the 80s of one of the great 70s bands. So this is my least favourite album. Still a brilliant album, still got some great tracks on it. In the Evening's great, like I said, Carouselambra's great. All of My Love is one of Robert's great songs, and he's a proper song. So often Zeppelin, it's the drum sound and the riffs and Robert's screamy voice that's making the track sound so amazing. But All of My Love is a real proper song, beautiful song. So yeah, brilliant album, but it's on the bottom of the list for me. The next one, and today I'm not looking at any of the albums that came after the sort of demise. I've included Coda, but I'm not looking at any albums after the demise. It's the albums that came out, between 69 and 82. So the next album on the list from me is this one, Led Zeppelin, The Song Remains the Same. From the soundtrack of the film. Now, if you know how the film was made, some of it was shot live, some of it was shot in the studio. There's some overdubs, and all the stories about John Paul Jones kept changing his clothes and all this sort of stuff. So there's continuity errors. This is a great album. There's some fantastic moments. As a kid, I loved the Dazed and Confused where they stretched out. I loved hearing a big John Bonham solo. I loved that. The jamming at the end of Whole Lot of Love I thought was amazing. The guitar solo that Page does on No Court was absolutely amazing. I think if you go to albums like the BBC live album or How the West Was Won, you'll hear Led Zeppelin more raw on what they were actually like live. I don't know whether this represents them 100% live. It's a good overview of the band in 1973 when it came out. So it's got such classic songs on: Rock and Roll Celebration Day, Song Remains the Same, Rain Song. It's a great album, but it's not one of the classic albums for me. The next album I've got, and I've actually pulled out the box set. I have the box set of Coda. I think Coda's got some of my favourite Zepp tracks on. The version of We're Gonna Groove is absolutely incredible. Poor Tom is an absolutely brilliant track. Things like Wearing and Tearing that didn't get on which album, Into the Outdoor, absolutely amazing. Of course, it's outtakes, so it's a little bit patchy. This box set, the reason I got the box set is because you get even more outtakes and all more little Zeppelin treasures on here. I think Coda's a great album, and I think it's better than I enjoy it more than In Through the Outdoors. So you know, if you're a Zepp fan and you haven't got it, check it out. It's a brilliant album. So we start to get now into, really, for me, some of the greatest rock albums ever made. So which one comes next? Well, for me, it would be House of the Holy. This again has got some incredible Zepp tracks on. For me as a drummer, I was fascinated by the crunge, that sort of 5/4 James Brown beat on there. This, if you're into prog, is probably Led Zeppelin at their most proggiest. I would say tracks like No Quarter, Song Remains the Same, Rain songs, out and out progressive rock songs. The arrangements have really expanded out on here. There's a lot of acoustic guitar and then mandolin, and there's a lot of structural changes on this. There's a lot of stylistic changes. You get, like, you know, acoustic stuff, and then you get funk, then you get reggae. It's a really great album. It's not quite in the same league as the later albums for me. It does have classic tracks on, but yeah, this one's I really love this album. I think it's a fantastic album. It's really hard to go through this, you know, but I've ranked it lower than this one, right? Presence. I absolutely love this album, whereas a lot of Zeppelin fans would probably rank this quite low. I think if you want to hear Led Zeppelin as a band, as a four-piece, in a room playing, and hearing the virtuosity of what one of the greatest rock bands in the world sounds like, it's this album. You know, the playing on this is just off the chart. You know, the stuff they're doing with the arrangements is absolutely incredible. I think it probably hasn't got a Stairway to Heaven on it or A Whole Lot of Love, which is why it doesn't rate highly. But in terms of listening to the band play, it's absolutely incredible. I think, is it T for One, the slow blues, one of the great slow blues they ever did. Achilles' Last Stand, which is a big proggy epic, one of the great proggy epics they ever did. I really rate this album, and I did once sit with Robert and say, I think this album's really great, and he agreed. He said, I think it's one of the best albums they did. This is one that if you have just got into Zeppelin, you haven't checked it out, because a lot of reviews saying, you know, not one of their better, check it out. You know, it's the playing on it is off the chart. You know, I'd say in terms of Led Zeppelin at the peak of their playing abilities, at the peak of their ability to play as an ensemble and change gear and, you know, drop the dynamics up and down and, you know, change the timings. You know, absolutely incredible album. And also Robert Plant's harmonica solo on, you know, Nobody's Fault But Mine. It's just one of the great moments in rock music. Absolutely brilliant album. Okay, we now come to the very first album here, Led Zeppelin 1. Absolutely brilliant album. All us drummers know their triplet work on Good Times, Bad Times. It's just such a stunning album, isn't it? It's amazingly produced for 1968-69. I think what's interesting about this is Good Times, Bad Times, Your Time Is Gonna Come. They're almost like pop songs. They stick out in the Zeppelin sort of catalogue as being, you know, almost like a sort of pop band, 60s pop band, you know, writing hit records and great, you know. But we also get things like, you know, I Can't Quit You Get Baby, How Many More Times, Dazed and Confused. A lot of these songs had come from the Yardbirds. I'm friends with Kevin Gammond as well as Robert, who was in the Band of Joy. And a lot of these arrangements, I think, also came from that time. They were ready to do this album, and that's what you hear is, even though they're a new band, some of these ideas have been developing for a while, and there's some incredible new ideas that just sort of blew everybody away. So great album. Why is it not up there with the greatest? I think we're waiting for that acoustic English folk music and them to really nail how they approach the blues. That still hasn't happened yet. It gets developed on this album. Again, one of the greatest rock albums ever made. Led Zeppelin 2, their second album, which has got a whole lot of love. It's also got Ramble On and Heartbreaker. I think this was recorded whilst they were on tour, jumping into various studios, dropping stuff down. Really, it should have been not that great if you're making an album like that, but this is one of the great rock bands of all time at the peak of their abilities, you know, so this is another incredible album. I feel that the first two albums are absolute classics, but we're waiting for the real incredible event to happen in Led Zeppelin, which is when they go off, him and Jimmy Page, Robert and Jimmy Page go off to Wales, to Brion, and start bringing in this acoustic folk influences. I think that happens on the next album, Led Zeppelin 3, which is why I've ranked it higher than this, which is insane, not ranking an album higher than this. This is one of the greatest albums ever made. Physical Graffiti. I think if I was to say to someone, if they wanted to buy an album by Led Zeppelin, and you wanted to give them a real fair representation of what Led Zeppelin was, it would be this album. They do everything on this, from the acoustic tracks through to the very hard funky tracks, through to the slow blues, through to the proggy epics, and a lot of quirkiness as well. There's no bad tracks on this album, obviously. It's just one of the great albums of all time. Why haven't I rated it as high as the next album, which is this one at number 2, Led Zeppelin 3. This is I think it's the second greatest album, and the reason is because I think this is the album where Led Zeppelin innovate the most. I can remember, I've obviously, you now know that at number 1 I have, Led Zepp 4, or the Untitled album, which I'm going to come to in a bit. But that is really taking everything into account. But I think my favourite Led Zeppelin album is this one, and this is the deluxe edition with the extra disc in. And I can remember Robert once asked me, what's your favourite Zepp album? I said it's Led Zepp 3, and he said, well, of course, that's the one where we really innovated and pushed everything up a gear. And so that's came from Robert. I agree. This is the album where Led Zeppelin are no longer just the great blues rock band of all time. They suddenly become the greatest rock band of all time, simply because they bring in these extra influences and do them properly on here. So, for example, on the first album, you get some blues tracks like let's have a look. Let's just pull this out here. So on here, we got some blues tracks like "You Shook Me All Night Long," "I Can't Quit You, Baby," and those are very good examples of like 60s blues explosion versions of old blues standards. On this album, we get the blues done in a different way, Gallows Pole, and especially Since I've Been Loving You. It's the blues, but it's now completely owned by Led Zeppelin. They get a take on the blues which is entirely their own and works without referring to the blues, if that makes sense, without referring back to those originals. So Gallows Pole for me, which is an old folk song, I think Lead Belly did it, but what you hear is their version is so unique, and it's so rooted in what Led Zeppelin are about. The English folk influences on here also push it up to another level. So I know this is a quieter album for Led Zeppelin. There's not as much heavy stuff on here, but again, the heaviest stuff, like Immigrant Song, is probably them at their best doing heavy stuff. So this is why this is number 2. It's probably my favourite Zeppelin album, but we can't really deny that. Led Zeppelin 4 or the Untitled album. So what do we have on here? Well, this has probably got, I don't need to look because it's inscribed on all our and on our rock memories. This probably has the greatest side on any album ever, I would say, which is side 1 of this, which opens up with Black Dog, one of the greatest rock riffs of all time, and then goes up to Rock and Roll, which is one of the greatest rock and roll tracks of all time. They basically take that little Richard sound, and at this point they know how to take that and turn it into something which is contemporary and classic, absolutely incredible. Then Battle of Evermore, which is like all those ideas on Led Zepp 3 just condensed down into one incredible folk track. It's got Sandy Denny from Fairport Convention on there, with Robert in her voice just weaving around. And then we have Stairway to Heaven, which, when I was a kid, I would have said was probably the greatest song ever made. And then you flip it over and it all gets just slightly weirder. And you get like a Misty Mountain Hop, with that sort of circular weird chanty vocal. Then you get Four Sticks, which is in 5/4, and it's quite strange. Then you get Going to California, which is almost like a Joni Mitchell American folk song, and then you end up with When the Levee Breaks, which is again this idea of taking a blues song and totally owning it and making it your own, so it stands up as a contemporary piece of music rather than just some white middle class English people playing an old blues song with electric instruments, which I think was maybe an issue with some of those early blues recordings. By this point they know how to turn that through this sort of nuclear reactor of the Led Zeppelin machine into something which is going to change music forever. I mean, how many times was When the Levee Break being sampled by people? It's so futuristic but so referring to the past, and I think that's something that Led Zeppelin and Robert were just geniuses at. So yeah, this would probably rank in my top 10 albums of all time, of all bands ever, which I might do that at some point. It's my favourite it's not my favourite Zepp album, but I think it's the greatest, most influential of all their albums. If you don't own a Led Zepp album and you want to go and buy one and you're wondering which one to get, of course you go and get this one. So I hope that's been of interest to Led Zeppelin and non-Led Zeppelin fans alike. And if you like what I'm doing, like this, and click subscribe, and I'll be doing some more stuff like this in the future, so keep an eye out, and thanks again for listening and watching.